And look at that. I'm live 35 seconds early. I know, it's a terrible thing. Anyway, so I just got impatient. I figured no one's going to hear about 35 seconds. I'm just going to blather for that first 35 seconds anyway. So I don't think it matters. So yeah, if you're here, we're live. If you're watching this live, you can comment in the. I think for you're probably seeing it down here below. For me, it's over here. Everything's reversed. I point to things all the time, and it's always backwards, and I never learn when my light's getting weird. Let me just get rid of it. There we go. Maybe that'll make life a little easier for everybody. Okay. I keep pointing to things, and it's reversed, and I've never learned how to do that except for right now. All right. So let's catch up again. Doobly-doos. Write your questions, comments. We can talk. If you're watching this recorded, you can't do that. But if you're here live, you can. So today, I've titled today's episode the way I have because I was originally thinking about just jumping right into the letters to 7 churches and maybe even getting to Pergamos and starting that conversation. Because like I said earlier, Pergamos, to really understand that just that one letter and the importance of that letter, that's almost a 2-episode thing. So we may actually get into Pergamos next time. I want to at least talk about Ephesus, but the thing is, it occurred to me just as I was kind of coming in, a lot of what we're dealing with, as far as there's 7, with these letters to the 7 churches, gets confused a lot, and there's a lot of questions that people have because in many ways it's very, very different from what we're used to seeing, right? And even the concept that God is writing a letter, or Jesus specifically is writing these letters, or is having John write these letters to these 7 angels who are over 7 churches, in itself is a little weird. And so a lot of people have come out and said, well, really what he means is the pastors over the 7 churches. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. But it's because of that I wanted to maybe start this episode off, or this study off, with a conversation of something a lot of people haven't heard or talked about, because it seems kind of contradictory to what we're taught in modern theology, which is the concept of the divine counsel. Michael Heiser has written a lot about this. And he has some excellent commentary on it. We're going to talk about a little bit of it. But I want to set up that whole mentality first, because it's very different from how we teach and how we even think of God today. But I think if we look at it, it actually makes more sense to what we actually see in our day-to-day lives and how God has operated all throughout the Bible. It makes way more sense. So let's talk about this idea of there being, like, why would there be angels over the church? Isn't Jesus the head of the church? The answer to that is yes, he is. So why are there angels over individual churches? To understand that, we have to understand, we kind of have to go backwards a little bit and go to and talk about this idea of a divine counsel, and even a little bit deeper into spirits being over nations and all of that. So let's jump first. So to talk about Revelation properly, we got to go to Deuteronomy. Honestly, it's why I chose Revelation as the first study we're doing, because to get a revelation, you have to pretty much go through the whole Bible. It's like you have to survey it, you have to understand it, because Revelation gives you something, you're like, what is this? Well, you got to go back. Again, this is a perfect example. Why are there angels over churches, right? It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense until you go back and you read a few things. And we're going to get into some controversies here. So I think anyone who knows me knows I'm not afraid of controversy. Okay. So why are we going back to the book of Deuteronomy with my non-photo blue pencil? We'll just ignore that. It's easier for me to, flip through, because I'm using, and I just lost it because I'm using an actual physical, tangible book like a Neanderthal. Well, it's the way I like to do things. And of course, I put it in there so I would find it quickly, and yeah, because I'm a genius. All right. It's 32 verse 8 is what we want to discuss. Now, what this is, I'm sorry, yeah, it's Deuteronomy. Sorry, Deuteronomy. Let me rephrase that. It's Deuteronomy 32 verse 8. And there's a Numbers. There we are. 31, 32. Okay. So this is one of Moses' many songs. Moses sang a lot, as did everybody in the Old Testament. Apparently, if you're in the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books, you are singing all the time. It's the sound of music out there in the Old Testament. So he's singing. He's basically giving this, and there's this interesting point here in verse 8. Let's start at verse 7 though. Remember the days of old. So again, this is 3,000 years ago, and Moses is like, remember way back in the day. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. This is verse 8. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, here's the weird thing. The Masoretic text reads, children of Israel. But the Septuagint reads, according to the sons of God. This is probably an entire episode unto itself, which is that the Septuagint may actually be a much more accurate translation or rendering of the Hebrew text than what the Masoretic text is. That's a whole conversation. But the point is, what is being said here is it's going back to the story of the Tower of Babel. And when it fell, God divided the languages. Well, at the same time, he set, according to the number of the, basically it's the number 70. Some have argued 72, but it's basically 70, that there were 70 original languages created at Babel and over each language got its own angel. Basically, it was the spirit that oversaw them. Now, again, the Masoretic text reads children of Israel, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would God divide them according to the number of a people that didn't exist yet? And really the key to that is, and of course I lost it because I set it down. I just realized I should have probably kept it open because I'm going to say the next line. You ever think you're brilliant and try doing something like this and you don't realize, oh, you're not? No. Of course I didn't think that because I know me. And I have to look at myself in the mirror, and I'm the one who usually gets, has to deal with me doing stupid things. So verse 9 says, for the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the place of his inheritance. And he goes on to talk more about Jacob and Israel. So the point is, what's being said here is, again, particularly if we take the Septuagint as a more accurate rendering of the original Hebrew, at Babel, God divided the nations. He divided the languages, and each nation has its own spirit over it. Israel, though, is a little different. Israel has God over it. Israel is the inheritance of God himself. Now, if you're looking for support to this very strange idea of there being angels over nations or spirits over nations, let's jump back to Daniel. See, my non-photo blue pencil has shown up again. I have a whole bunch of them. I draw comics in non-photo blue that isn't, whatever. Anyway, chapter 10, verses, we'll start in verse 12. Then he, the angel, which, is supposed to be Gabriel, said to me, Daniel, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the king of Persia. Okay, so I'm going to put my pencil back there in case I need to come back to it. Big setup there, right? Daniel's been praying. He's been fasting in 21 days. And then all of a sudden, finally, the angel shows up. And Gabriel's like, hey, dude, sorry. A little late. And of course, we have like, well, why isn't it just like that? Well, it's because there was someone withstanding this angel, this who most people think is Gabriel. Gabriel's mentioned earlier, so probably him, maybe not, doesn't matter. Point is, he was withstood. And who withstood him? The prince of Persia, over the nation of Persia, not specific. It's interesting. The language there is a little interesting. It took Michael himself, who's one of the 7 named archangels. We actually get them in the name from the book of Enoch. We'll talk about all that in the future. 7 archangels. And again, we see that number 7 all throughout the book of Revelation. It's very important. There's 7 archangels. Michael being one of them, who is also, as we learn, not just an archangel, but the angel over the kingdom of Israel. We find that out in chapter 12. So it's something interesting here. Each nation has an angel over it, a spirit over it that is overseeing it. Why? Ultimately, because that's what God wants. This is where things get a little complicated. Because we teach in the Western world that God is all-powerful, he's omniscient, he's in control of everything. All of that is true. But he also shares authority. Again, he created the universe, but he didn't create everything just to flop around. Everything has a reason and a purpose for existing. Included in that is the idea of authorities, that there were angels that were set up over to do particular jobs. Now, originally, humans, we had the power over the planet, literally over the land and the animals. That was our role. We sort of flubbed that, and then with the Tower of Babel, God's like, okay, fine, you don't want me over you. Great, I'll let you have these guys. And these were thought to be 70, could be more, but it's thought to be 70 angels were set out. Some of them evil, maybe all of them evil. We don't really know. We're not expressly told. But these are part of the divine council. And when we see it all throughout the Old Testament, it talks about God sitting at the council of the gods. Well, what's happening? He's sitting down, and there are these other beings. And God's like, look, this is my thing. This is what I'm doing. We can choose to roll with it, not what, you will do it, but how you do it, it's up to you, right? So it's interesting that God allows freedom within the angelic kingdom, because we don't think of angels having free will, but they do. They actually make mistakes. We even see when in Kings, where God's like, hey, I want this king gone. How are we going to do it? There's an angel or a spirit who shows up and says, I'm going to lie to the guy and tell him everything's cool. He's going to show up and we'll kill him there. God's like, let's do it. It's cool. Let's roll. And it seems so foreign to our concept of this very dictatorial figure who just sits there and is like, that's happening. That's happening. That's happening. Well, the problem is God doesn't operate that way. He has shared his authority. And it's his authority to share, and he kind of is more like a CEO. He wants to see everyone running and doing things. And that's how he operates. And there's leeway in what he's like, this is the goal. How you go about getting there that's due to your free will, your talents, your skills, your wisdom. You can do that. And so it throughout history, what we see is God doing these things, and we just get these glimpses of it. But it's very much there. This idea of a divine council, of God sitting there saying, I'm not, there are things that absolutely have to happen. There's things that's within his will, but it is there. And that's translated into these 7 angels. What is God saying? What he's saying is that these 7 individual churches, and probably every church. Now, is it every individual church, or is it like church theologies, or I don't know. But what he's saying is, at least for these 7 churches specifically, there was an angel put on top of them, like a guardian angel, basically saying, It's like his job was to sort of help them out, right? The Old Testament, and we have to remember the New Testament was written by people who only had the Old Testament. Well, okay, by the time you get into Paul's letters, I would argue it's the Old Testament plus Matthew. I am of the opinion that Matthew is the first book written, and for the New Testament, there's a whole lot of arguments for that. Most people say it's Mark. I think Matthew makes a better argument, or there's a better argument for Mark. Or Matthew. That's entirely not really the point here. The point is they had an Old Testament mindset, and in a very Hebraic mindset, because they were all Hebrews. We have a very Western mindset, and as much as our Western culture has grown up with this Judeo-Christian mentality, we've also sort of thrown away some stuff that everyone kind of just knew and accepted, and we've strayed away from because we rejected more and more of these things. Part of that's rejecting the Apocrypha. Part of that is rejecting the Book of Enoch. Book of Enoch makes it explicitly clear that God set up angels to do particular tasks, and that God isn't. It's not that he's distant or separate, but rather he has separated himself, and he allows his creation to work as he sees fit, or as in within their realms. They each get to express themselves and their power and their wisdom and their skills in how they operate and do the things that in the tasks he's assigned them to do. So that's what these seven angels are. They are overseeing each individual church, the people there, and how it's going. So he also is saying, hey, you're in many ways, these angels are sort of allowing humans to go in a particular way. So the fact that God's using is sort of doing it this way, it feels weird, but it's actually very, very in keeping with what we see throughout the Old Testament. This idea of there being a divine council, there being a council of gods. And of course, we think, well, there's only one God. Well, yes, there is the God. But we also have to understand that a lot of those titles, it's just a title. It's saying president, right? We have one president of the United States, but there are many presidents of other nations that are lesser. That's kind of how the Old Testament is set up. We have the God. He creates everything. He is all powerful. He is eternal. He alone is God. But that he has set up these other beings, these other lesser beings that are just angels over humans, and they sort of usurp that mantle, that title. Now in the Old Testament, a lot of that is usually the word Elohim. And what's interesting is Elohim doesn't necessarily mean God per se in the way we mean. We mean more spirit is probably a better way of saying it. I actually kind of like how Enoch renders it. It talks about it. He talks about God as the Lord of spirits. I mean, he's the prime spirit. It's rare. The American Indians actually inherited a lot of that, and that's a whole other conversation. But there's evidence that at least probably the tribe of Dan made it to America, in the Cherokee. But they took it as, they call him literally the Great Spirit, like it's just the one. Then everything's a lesser spirit out underneath that. That's of differing orders and differing powers, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. So for the people originally reading this, that wouldn't have struck them as odd. It strikes us as odd because of that, right? We're just not used to that. We have a very different conception of how God runs the universe than how they viewed it. I tend to think their view is a little more accurate. They were there when it was written. So anyway, so let's actually jump into the text. But now that we've set that up as to why God is talking to these angels, and that these are actual angels, it's not a metaphor for a pastor or anything. I know many pastors like to say that because it makes them feel better. It's an actual angel. You'll just have to deal with it. So, chapter 2. To the angel of the church of Ephesus write, these things say he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. Remember from chapter 1, he sees Jesus. Jesus has a sharp sword coming out of his mouth. He's holding 7 stars in one hand. There are these 7 golden lampstands. The stars are the angels. The lampstands represent the churches, individual. I know your good. I know your works, your labor, your patience, and that you cannot bear those who are evil. And you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. And you have persevered, and have patience, and have labored for my name's sake, and have not become weary. Nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. But this you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. We'll stop there. In many ways, certain things become evident if you read all 7 letters. But the thing is, some people have argued what the Nicolaitans are. We don't know. They're theories, but no one really knows for certain. The key thing for Ephesus, though, is it starts off by saying, hey, you're doing great in these things, right? But it's all head knowledge. It's all, hey, you're theologically right. You test, spirits and apostles. You're doing these things. You hate the Nicolaitans. They were some form of a cult or following away group. That's all we know. But they've lost their first love, and that was enough to if they didn't turn from their ways, if the angel didn't guide them away from their ways, then the lampstand itself could be removed. And the thing I find very frightening about that is I find Ephesus being something I really personally could, sort of understand. It's like it's a church it's so caught up in being right and doing the study and making certain everything, all the boxes are checked, that everything's right. It's accurate. But they've lost their first love, and they didn't do the things they did at the beginning. Well, what were the things we don't know exactly what the things they were doing at the beginning, but I think that the thing is, the trick there is, it's in the text. They're not doing things they did at first. Well, some of the first things that you do when you're a Christian is, that love. You're giving more money, you're giving tithes, to people who need it. You're helping those in need. You want to share Jesus with everyone. And it sounds like what's happened is this church has become very cold. It's all head. There's no heart, because that heart needs to move you towards helping other people, making the world a better place, serving your fellow man. It's very easy to say, "Oh, but I'm here." It's sort of the concept of the elder son, right? And we talked about the prodigal son. In many ways, I think that everyone's the prodigal son, and everyone can be the elder brother. I think there's one very specific thing that's messaged there, but for our purposes, the elder son, he's like, hey, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I come home, and from being out in the field all day, and you're throwing a party for my worthless brother. What's happening here, right? In the same way, the message is that the elder son had sort of lost sight of what was important to the father. Even though he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, he was honoring his father by doing what he was supposed to be doing. He lost the point. He lost the love. The same way, the church of Ephesus, can't talk right now, has sort of lost the point. Like they're doing all the right things, but the love is sort of gone from where they had started, and they need to get back to that. It needs to be not just internal; it needs to be external as well. like I said, I find that one, Ephesus, really sort of a challenging one because I can see myself in Ephesus a lot. Starting in verse 8, the persecuted church. And to the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. So, what's happening in Smyrna? It's the persecuted church, right? And what's he saying? He doesn't chastise them. There's no, hey, you need to work. No, he's like saying, hey, keep this up, keep going. You're going to be under persecution in school, but if you make it, right, you overcome. Even it's like, it doesn't matter if you go to prison, it doesn't even matter if you're killed. If you persevere through this, you'll receive that second life. Because remember, Jesus is talking about you get to come back. It's almost like, okay, pardon the metaphor, but this will make a lot more sense. Remember you played Mario, the original one. Most of you, if you're younger, you're playing these newer games. It doesn't matter. But Mario, you're running along, you're stomping on Goombas and turtle shells and all the whole 9 yards. If you fell, like sometimes you're like, okay, I'm gonna try this. And if you fall, you died, you didn't care because you had an extra life, right? Kind of in the same way, that's how God expects us to live this life. Because we are to live knowing that we're going to come back. We think, and that's the real life. That's the reward. It's like it's not just that you die and go to heaven. You die, you go to heaven, but then God's going to remake, as we see at the end of the book, the whole thing. We get to be resurrected. We get to be kings and priests. It's like, there's not really a downside. Just go live your life. And the problem is we often try to hold on to this life so tightly that we end up not using it appropriately. It's sort of like vacation days, right? You don't want to just frivolously use the vacation days, but then it gets to the end of the year, right? And your company's like, hey, you can't roll those days over. You can't just keep piling them up forever. And you're like, I got 2 weeks to do at the end of the, still left at the end of the year, or a week and a half left at the end of the year because you only took a couple weekends off, like a couple Fridays off. And then you're like, well, what do I do with it? And then, of course, if you wait too long, then you can't go and do anything because, the company's like, nope, sorry, like half the crew is gone. You can't take those days. They've already asked off. And so now you're left with the fact that you've got these days you can't use, right? Because you were so busy trying to preserve them throughout the year for something that you really wanted, they were left over, but now you don't get them. And our life is very much the same way. It's meant to be lived 100%. Just jump into it. Go. Don't be afraid. Don't do stupid things, but jump into it. Live it with gusto because this is it. This is the one chance you get to do this one thing. But then after that, again, if you're a Christian, you live on forever. You will have another life where you will be a king and you will be a priest and it will be perfect. It's like there is no downside here, but let's throw that Mario up against that to make that jump, because if you don't, oh well, who cares? You got another life. It's just the life's over there and it's better than this one anyway. It's and so in the same way, that's what he's charging them to do. He's like, hey, there's going to be pain, there's going to be death, there's going to be, there's going to be persecution, but that's okay. because when you persevere, when you make it through, I've got something better for you in this, right? There's another life coming. You've got this. Just make it through. And it's interesting that we often think of making it through as, well, everything's going to be fine at the end and everyone makes it, everyone lives. And that's not the position that they're talking about for Smyrna. They're like, no, some of you are going to die. Okay, but if you die, you still made it through. The trick is not to throw away your testimony. I don't want to get into arguments over whether or not you can lose your salvation or not. That's not really the point of this. Although you could argue through there that there is sort of that intended warning, but the point is, it's about not giving up. It's saying, hey, you will get a crown by persevering, going through this tribulation. Also, if you go all the way back to the first episode, I talked about how the seven churches, some people have viewed them as, or that the book of Revelation was historical, right? The sort of the preterist view, or even the historical view. This is kind of one of those sections of the book that lends itself to that. And the reason being is it talks about 10 days, right? There's 10 days of persecution coming. Well, again, that church actually was persecuted historically. So John's text was prophesying about a real event that happened, and we'll see some more of that. And so, again, my opinion as to what the seven churches are, these letters are, I don't believe it's necessarily the church age. I do think that it is these were seven churches. He is addressing seven very specific events and things at the time, because they all ultimately, one way or another, apply to everybody today, right? Again, Ephesus really kind of hits home to me, and it tells me what I need to be looking out for, and where my particular predilections could lead me astray. And this one, it's for those who are seeing persecution. It's to remind them, hey, it doesn't matter if you're in Saudi Arabia today, or you're on the other side of the world, or if you're here, it doesn't matter where you are. Persecution comes, and there will be trying times, but you could go over it. You can get over that. You can get through it, even if it costs you your life, because you have to remember there's something bigger and better coming. We're doing really good on time. I was worried that this was going to take longer. So we're going to get to Pergamos. What I think we'll do today, though, is, since we got like 30 minutes left, I bet you I can at least get us set up for Pergamos. I think I can. Let's try it. By the way, New King James lists Pergamos as the compromising church. That's never good when the Bible's like, hey, this dude, compromising. And to the angel of the church in Pergamos write, these things says he who is the sharp two-edged sword. I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have therefore those who hold to the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Thus you also have those who hold to the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. They get mentioned again, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come to you quickly, and will fight against them with a sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat, and I will give him a white stone, and on that stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. Okay. I really wish we knew what the heck the Nicolaitans were up to, because apparently God doesn't dig it at all. Sometimes you read the Bible and you're like, could we have gotten like a little more here? I'd really appreciate it, but we don't, sadly. Some have argued the Nicolaitans were into like sexual immorality, right? And because that's what he talks about with Balaam, and yet it's but sexual immorality is mentioned later in the verse, so I don't know that that's what's happening there. All we know is the Nicolaitans were no good, and some of them held to it. Not all of them, but some of them. Some held to what Balaam was talking about. I find that interesting because Balaam's big sin was he was a prophet of God before, really before the prophets were established within Israel itself. And so it's kind of an interesting thing when you really, particularly before you when you get, prior to all of that happening, to Israel being created in the traditional prophet mantles that we think of. Balaam's just this prophet sitting out there, and an evil, a secular king comes to him. And he's like, "Hey, how can we do this?" And he's like, "I can't. Sorry, can't curse them, but if you get them to do, throw some whores at them, and God will take care of them himself." Really interesting sort of situation. We will need to dig into that more, but for our purposes here, let's. It's just kind of interesting that it's like sexual immorality is over here, and yet Balaam is mentioned separately. It's weird. You think those two would be more tightly knit? Anyway, point being, this is a church that withstood persecution. There was a martyr there, and the person's named. So someone in that church was killed for the faith, and they held fast. But they were willing to compromise with the world around them and adopt and allow people who were from the outside in, and they were compromising with their beliefs. They were allowing them to be in the church. And let me state this. This is one of those, you hear people say, "Oh, the Bible has all these contradictory things." I have never once, when someone says, "Oh, look at all there's all the contradictory material in the Bible," I've never once had anyone actually answer when I say, "Really? What contradictory material?" No one's ever given me an answer. Not in 30 years. I'm not 30, I'm older, but I haven't really been doing this my whole life. I've never once heard anyone give me an actual answer to that. For me, this one thing is one of those things where I'm like, weird. So for me personally, I'm just keeping it real with y'all. It talks about teaching those to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Well, Paul talks about that in his writings. He's basically saying, "Hey, it doesn't matter with the idol. If it was sacrificed to the idol, who cares? It's not real." So the fact that we have that sort of that seeming contradiction has always bothered me. But I think the secret there is actually in the text itself. Let me read it again. Because it says, where'd it go? I just had it. It's over here. It's you never want to have this blank sound, and yet here I am. The whole doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block. To eat things sacrificed to idols, and okay, so Balak to eat things sacrificed. Okay, so the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. So the trick there, or the key to that is, it's not saying that the people were necessarily doing that per se. He's referencing what they were doing in the Old Testament. But let's leave it there as that's what they were doing. They were eating the meat sacrificed to idols. What I think is really happening there is they were participating in the cultural norms, right? Because I think the whole metaphor of Balaam there is really what Balaam was doing was he told Balak to entice the Israelites to engage in the sins of the world in which they lived. And that's what was happening with this particular church. They were engaging, in those worldly behaviors, right? So let's put all that together. When it talks about meats being sacrificed to idols, what he's doing is pointing to what occurred in the days of Balaam. It's not what was happening then at that time. However, it could have been, because that was still a thing. Paul talks about it. But what it's saying is that if you're basically eating a meat sacrificed to an idol, it's because you're at the party, basically, and because it ties that and the sexual immorality together, right? So what's happening is they are participating in those feasts, in those orgies, and sorry kids, that's what was happening. And so what it's really about is the fact that they had compromised. They were allowing those in their church who had compromised and were engaging in the worship of these false idols, even though they were saying, well, we're not really there to worship, we're just hanging out where it's a party or whatever, or maybe we're trying to to bring people over to Christ, but they're still there. It's like probably a better metaphor for today would be, I'm going to go preach to the hookers at the strip joint, and you're over there doing a couple lines of coke, and you're getting drunk, and you're doing what you do there. We'd look at you and be like, that doesn't work. That's what's happening here. That's what they were doing. They were participating in the world. But I think there's a broader message there, because I don't think everyone's, I think most of us like, yeah, that's not what you do. You don't go and hang out in the strip clubs like that. But I do think we are really willing to accept a lot of our culture, and we allow that to dictate how we worship God. We allow our culture to determine what is and is not acceptable. It's easy to condemn the big things, the things that are obvious, right? It's much harder to focus on the smaller things that God does still care about. Everyone's happy to look through the New Testament and Paul's writings, where it talks about homosexuals and adulterers, and like, well, they won't enter and murderers, and it's like and thieves, they won't enter the kingdom of heaven. But they do tend to jump over the fact that included in that list are alcoholics and gossipers. Gossipers aren't making it into heaven. I think the modern news media is going to have some problem. Just saying. But we tend to skip over those, right? God's saying, hey, this is all equal to me. This is all sin. You see gossip as just, nothing. But God sees it as important. Just as important as any of the others listed. When was the last time you heard a sermon on that? When was the last time? I mean, let's face it. We all know churches are hotbeds of gossip. Compromise. Just like Pergamos. It's easy to look at people who are going to these bacchanalias and eating meat and participating in that sinful behavior. It's a lot harder, though, to look at yourself and be like, well, maybe I'm not doing that. But am I compromising my beliefs with what the world says? Do I moderate my tone? Do I adopt the world's thinking about things? Do I accept how the world views things? Do you watch movies that maybe have a little too much sex and violence in them? That's unnecessary. And you know what? Honestly, there's a point here where I kind of have to, let me be real with y'all. I mean, you seem like a good group of people that I can't possibly see. What's bothered me for the last couple of weeks is something I've known for a long time, because I've worked with people who have been traumatized by it. I have to be very vague on that, because I just have to be vague. But we all know how Hollywood works. We all know that there are politicians who have access to children. I don't want to get into the whole Pizzagate thing. I think some of that was disinformation, but the core of it, that there are people who basically get away with child abuse, with doing some very grotesque things, participating in demonic services. These are all real things. They're tangible things. This is not metaphor or myth or hyperbole. It's real. Personally, I'm wondering and have wondered for a long time, but it's really come to a head over the last couple of weeks. Can I continue even really watching any television or any movies that are produced, knowing about who produced them, knowing that, and I'm ultimately supporting that system, even though not everyone. It's not everyone, obviously, but they exist. Jeffrey Epstein existed, and he was protected by the news media. Cindy McCain said everyone. She recently came out and said everyone knew about this. Everyone knew, but no one would do anything because they were all afraid of him. Corey Feldman came out talking about what happened to him recently, and Elijah Wood. Numerous child actors have come out and said, "Yeah, this is a real thing." A lot of them, some of the ones who have come forward have said, "I was protected from it, but this was real. This is a real thing that happens." And it's, you don't have to dig very hard to find some really weird things about some of these people. So for me, how much of that is participating in the world? And let's take it one step further. Let's get rid of all of the ethereal things that are behind the cameras. Let's talk about what's on the screen. I love superhero movies. I love action movies. But in the same way, I have to ask, sure, it's not real. It's all fantasy. They're actors and special effects. No one ever gets hurt, right? We know this. We know it, but when you see it, it actually bypasses the logic. That's why you cry in movies. It's not that you don't know it's real. And it's not really that it's actually affecting you because you're like, oh, he convinced me. No, it's the fact that you can see it. As an artist, I've learned how the brain works and how to, deceive people for art, like, forced perspective, right? How do you make Spider-Man look like he's flying across New York when it's a static shot? It's a static image, flat. How do you do that? Well, you have to trick the brain. In the same way, when you see things, your brain your brain initially doesn't actually realize it bypasses. It goes immediately to your motion centers, to your fight or flight. This is why people who listen to the big thing always goes back to the Nixon Kennedy debate, right, in the 60s. Everyone who listened to it on the radio said without a doubt that Nixon won. Everyone who watched it said that it was Kennedy who won. Why? Visuals. They bypassed and it went straight to the emotions. Maybe we should move all of our politicians' debates to radio again. That may be a thought. Anyway, point being, when it bypasses that. So how does that apply to the movies? Well, ultimately, what that means is, you see some guy getting cut up and shot up in a movie, your brain doesn't actually know it's fake. You understand that it's fake, but your brain doesn't. Your emotion center doesn't understand that it's fake. I'm not saying it turns you into a killer or a murderer or anything like that, but you're still enjoying the pain of another human being. Is that compromise? I don't have an answer for that. I don't have an answer for is it, if I'm spending money to go see a movie, although I can't really do that now, but if I'm spending money to go see a movie that's run by someone who's abusing children, am I ultimately funding that child abuse? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that yet. So, are we all just compromised? Are we all pergamous? I don't have an answer for that yet. Maybe that's something we need to ask ourselves. But there is one thing about Pergamus that we're going to need to spend a lot of time on next week talking about, because I need to get a lot of stuff together to show you um, visually, because you kind of have to see it for it to make a lot of sense. But let me start by this. In It talks about how Pergamus is that Satan has put his throne there, right? Now, a lot of us think, okay, well, what he's referring to is there was a temple of Zeus, and that's what he's referring to. Well, yeah, that is exactly what he's referring to. It is a temple of Zeus that was in Pergamus that he was referring to. Absolutely. But he's also talking about the literal Satan putting a literal throne there. And we have to understand that. And it actually ties very much into the rest of what's going to happen, both in the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel, and what's going on today. So we need to kind of go backwards a little bit. We talk, if in most of us are at least aware of the fact that in the intertestamental period, as it is called, the Greeks took over the world, right? Herod, Alexander the Great goes and just conquers everything. He marries one nation, the king of another nation. That's a different thing. Anyway, so he goes out. He literally Hellenizes the world, turns everyone into Greek. During that time, though, after his death, we had, different people trying to do different things. And during the Maccabean Revolution, when the Jews tried to rebel against the Greeks, what we had was, I cannot pronounce his name, and if I had it in front of me, I still couldn't pronounce his name. I really plan on this being next episode. Anyway, I'll have his name for you. I'll have someone say it out to me so I can actually try and emulate it. But anyway, he goes and actually sacrifices a pig on the altar in the Jewish temple, right? And ultimately, he still, after all that's done, you have the Maccabean Revolution, the temple is cleansed, because he set up an altar. That altar gets moved and is reset up in Pergamus on an altar. Like the altar itself is set on this much larger temple, right? It's a whole complex. It's built by the same guy. It's not a coincidence. There is, again, we start off talking about the seven angels, right? Being over these individual churches, because spirits are over individual things. When Paul talks about that our fight is ultimately with the spirit world, with the principalities and rulers of the sky, that's what he means. He means this very legitimately, that there are supernatural beings overseeing the affairs of men. The question is, which group do you fall into? Who are you listening to? Well, Satan literally was hanging out at that altar, and there is something to that. Again, we're going to have to dedicate a whole episode to it. It's very interesting. But that altar was built by the same Greek king who sacrificed a pig on the inside the temple, inside the Jewish temple. He goes and does that, and so he sets up the Pergamon altar. Now, here's the thing: that's there. Jesus says that's where Satan has set his throne. That altar doesn't stay in Pergamus. I'm gonna titillate you with a little tease here. The Pergamus altar, the temple, the Holocaust altar to Zeus. Holocaust just means burnt offering, but the Holocaust altar to Zeus in what is now Turkey, Pergamus, it was ancient Greece. Greece was both the islands and then Turkey, Asia Minor. That whole altar thing doesn't stay there at all. It goes a traveling, my friends. And I'm going to leave it there. Next episode's pretty much going to be mostly just about the Pergamus altar, or the Pergamon altar. It's a really interesting study, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun with it. Again, it ties very much into this idea that as above, so below, right? The spirit, there are spiritual powers at work in our world. In fact, let me end on this. The reason that there are symbols that sort of trickle through history, they keep showing up again and again. The reason that certain behaviors keep showing up again and again is because that there are supernatural forces at work in the world that we are slaves to. If you are not reborn, if you're not a Christian, if you haven't given of yourself to the Lord so that you can be born again, you're enthralled by that. And those are the forces that we fight. That's why, the last few years, people have gone nuts. And you kind of look at them and you're like, those people are nuts. I won't say who. I won't, because I don't want to make it a thing. But my wife has even pointed out to me, she goes, of particular politicians, she'll see them on the screen. She'll be like, why does she look crazy? Sorry. Yeah, okay. It's not just one. There's a couple. But they're like, why does that particular politician look crazy? Just flat out nuts. Why? It's like it's in their eyes. And it's not just one woman. There's a couple. But there's also a few men. And she's like, these people just look like they're crazy. What's going on? It's because they are. They're literally being driven insane by these spirits that are in work in the world today. It's also the same spirits that influence the people who, again, it's like, why are they putting certain things in movies? You're like, that was completely unnecessary. Why are they doing that? Well, they're doing it to appease these creatures that have been set over man and has enthralled man because they want to be enthralled by them. We rejected God time and time again. Humanity has rejected God. God has to keep coming to us. Again, Jesus, if you are reborn, if you've accepted him as your savior, you're reborn into that family. You are now part of that nation. You are a part of God. And God is your chief prince now. That's why we can look at people and just say, you're a few bubbles off a plum, aren't you? Well, it's not their fault per se. I mean, you can say it's their fault because they're refusing to follow Jesus, but it is that supernatural power within that's running the world that they're slave to. They can't control it. If you're a slave to the system, you're a slave to the system. Pity them. Pray for them. They're not, again, they aren't your enemy. It's the devil. It's the demons. It's the powers and principalities over this world that are our enemy. They're just, unfortunately, there, and they're not listening. They should be pitied. Pitied and prayed for. All right. You know what? This is going to sound a little touchy-feely, but I think it's appropriate. It's very easy to live your life, and we hear the messages of the world. In fact, this is, this is exactly how we should end. Pergamos. They were compromising. Why? Because they had withstood the power. They watched their friends die, but they withstood. But then they started to compromise, get along. The ears, they were hearing it just a little bit. It's like, it's okay if you do just this one thing. The world lies to us. The creatures in charge of this world lie to us all the time. Don't listen to it. You are better, stronger, more important than you think. Even if you tell yourself no one cares, I guarantee you there's a human being out there who cares about you. And there's a job that you have to do. God created you for a purpose. Just as God had created angels and archangels and powers and principalities to do certain things, you were created to do a particular task. It's not random chance that you exist. It's not random chance that you are where you are. It's not random chance that you have the talents and wisdom and intellect that you do. There's someone there that you are there to reach. You are important to someone. You matter. And even if the world, in the world, there was no one in the world who mattered, and you were just completely alone, you still matter to God. God took the care and time to create you. He's overseen you. You're part of his family. You matter far more than you could ever imagine. There is nothing in vain if it is in God. It's all part of something. We just don't see it yet. We can't. It's like looking on the backside of a rug, right? Where it's all messy and crossed over, and it doesn't look like it's supposed to. You see the substrates. But you flip that rug over, and you see this beautiful tapestry. It's life. You're a thread. You can't see it, but you are. And you're part of something much bigger and much more glorious than you can possibly imagine. There's not one thread in tapestry that doesn't matter. So don't listen to the world when it says, compromise a little bit, it'll make your life easier. Life's not meant to be easy. You're Super Mario. You go leap. Go do that. You've got another life coming. Who cares? Go live with gusto. Do the thing you're supposed to do. Because you matter. Because everything you do matters. Because there's someone out there, maybe a lot of somebody's, maybe just the one. You're there for them. You're there to contact them. You're the one to bring them into the family. You're there to tell them that they can keep going. Life oftentimes is about saying yes one more time than the world can say no. Maybe you're just there to, like Smyrna. It's like, just keep going. Make it through. Maybe you're the one person who can look somebody in the eye and say, just one more day. I know people who are alive because one person said, give him one more day. You can be that person. Because you matter. Because everyone you know matters. They matter to God. So don't give up. I'll see you next time.